In a quiet suburban neighborhood, the air carried the scent of blooming flowers mixed with the faint trace of freshly cut grass. Children's laughter drifted from a distant corner, the rhythmic squeak of bicycle wheels echoing on the pavement. It was the kind of place where life moved slowly, where neighbors waved politely across fences and evenings ended with calm silence. At the end of one of these calm streets stood a modest house with a wooden fence painted in faded brown. Behind that fence lived Mark Winters, a middle-aged man whose closest companion was an aging dog named Duke. Duke was a German Shepherd mix who had lived for almost 12 years at Mark's side. His muzzle had turned gray, his once powerful stride now replaced by careful, deliberate steps that betrayed the stiffness in his joints. Age had stolen his speed, but not his dignity, and certainly not his loyalty. For Mark, Duke was not just a pet. He was a guardian, a confidant, and a silent friend who had watched years slip by with patient eyes. Duke's favorite spot was in the backyard, under a patch of afternoon sun where the ground stayed warm. Each day, he would lie there, soaking in the golden light, his ears twitching to the rustle of leaves, his breathing slow and steady. That afternoon was no different. Mark had left the house briefly to run errands, fully expecting to return to the same peaceful sight. He could not have imagined how that peace would soon shatter. A police cruiser rolled slowly into the street, its tires crunching against the asphalt. 2 uniformed officers stepped out, their boots heavy against the pavement. One was tall, broad-shouldered, his face stern and unreadable. The other was shorter, with sharp eyes that flickered with hesitation as if he himself questioned why they were there. Without knocking on doors, without announcing their intentions, the officers walked straight toward the brown wooden fence and peered inside. There, lying on the grass, was Duke. His eyes were half closed, his tail curled loosely against his flank, his chest rising and falling with the rhythm of a dog drifting into sleep. The sudden shadow of 2 strangers falling across him stirred him awake. His ears twitched and he lifted his head slowly, confusion clouding his faded eyes. The tall officer barked out a command, his voice harsh and startling. "Get up! Move!" The sound pierced the gentle silence of the backyard. Duke scrambled awkwardly, his paws slipping against the grass as he tried to stand. His legs trembled under his weight, his tail tucked tightly beneath him. Fear coursed through his body, his mind unable to comprehend why these men shouted at him in his own yard. A whine escaped Duke's throat, thin and pitiful. It was not a growl, not a bark of defiance, but the sound of a creature caught off guard, terrified and too frail to resist. The shorter officer frowned, glancing at his partner as if uncertain. But the tall one remained firm, his hand twitching near the belt at his waist where tools of authority hung heavy. Inside nearby houses, curtains shifted. Neighbors pressed their faces to glass, whispering in alarm. "What's going on at Mark's house?" one voice murmured. "Why are the police yelling at his dog?" Another neighbor gasped, "That's Duke. He's harmless. What could they possibly want with him?" Duke retreated step by step until his back pressed against the fence. His ribs expanded rapidly as he panted in panic. The harsh voice of the officer thundered again. "This dog was reported as dangerous. Stay still." The word dangerous rang through the air, turning more heads. A child who had been pedaling his bike froze at the corner, staring with wide eyes. An older woman lowered her watering can and whispered under her breath, "That poor animal. He's barely strong enough to walk." The atmosphere thickened with unease. Some neighbors raised their phones, recording the scene. Others muttered from behind fences, voices swelling in protest. "That dog's been here for years. He never hurt anyone." But the tall officer did not waver. His figure loomed like a wall of steel over the trembling dog. His partner shifted uneasily, his eyes darting between Duke and the gathering witnesses, as though realizing something was wrong but not yet daring to speak it. Duke released another soft howl, long and mournful. It carried through the neighborhood like a cry for help, sending a shiver down spines. The shorter officer clenched his jaw, visibly uncomfortable now, while the taller one advanced a step closer, shadow falling darker across Duke's weakened body. At that very moment, the low hum of an approaching engine broke through the tense silence. A blue sedan turned onto the street and rolled to a halt in front of the modest house. The driver's door flew open with force. Mark Winters stepped out. His face hardened the instant his eyes caught sight of the scene unfolding in his yard. His heart slammed against his chest, and a surge of adrenaline coursed through him. There was Duke, pressed into the fence, trembling, cornered by two officers whose hands twitched with authority. There were neighbors gathered, whispers crackling like sparks in the air, and there was his old friend, whimpering, pleading without words for rescue. Mark's steps quickened, fury rising in his veins. He stormed toward the gate, his voice cutting through the tense air. "What are you doing to my dog?" The officers turned sharply, their eyes narrowing as if bracing for confrontation. The tall officer stiffened, his shoulders squared, while the shorter one flinched at the sudden presence of the rightful owner. Neighbors held their breath, waiting for the clash. And in that single frozen moment, the quiet backyard transformed into a stage where fear, loyalty, and authority collided. Mark's pulse thundered in his ears as he pushed open the wooden gate, his feet carrying him across the yard with quick strides. His voice, sharp and brimming with anger, had already pierced the scene, but now his presence filled the air with a heavier force. Neighbors leaned closer from behind their curtains, some even stepping outside to witness the unfolding storm. Phones were raised higher, recording every moment. Duke whimpered when he saw his master, his ears flattening against his head. His body trembled, but his cloudy eyes reflected a faint relief. His savior had arrived. Mark reached his dog's side and crouched down, sliding his hand along Duke's back. He whispered in a low, soothing voice, "It's okay, boy. I'm here now. No one's going to hurt you." Duke pressed against him, his heartbeat rapid under his fur. The moment filled Mark with both sorrow and fury. He lifted his head, his eyes blazing as they locked onto the tall officer. "Explain yourselves. What gives you the right to harass my dog in his own yard?" The tall officer stood rigid, jaw set like stone. His hand lingered close to his utility belt, a silent show of power. His voice was cold, clip. "We received a complaint about a dangerous dog roaming these properties. This address matches the report. We have reason to believe this animal may be a threat." Mark's lips curled into a disbelieving snarl. He gestured at Duke, whose frail body leaned into him for support. "A threat? Look at him. He's 12 years old, his joints are stiff, and he spends most of his days lying in the sun. Dangerous isn't the word I'd use. Frail is more like it." The shorter officer shifted his weight from one foot to the other, uncertainty shadowing his features. His eyes flicked toward Duke, taking in the shaking limbs and mournful expression. A crease formed between his brows as though he were questioning the validity of the call that brought them here. Still, the tall officer pressed forward. His tone hardened. "Sir, step back. We need to assess the animal for ourselves." Mark rose to his feet, his posture tall and unyielding. The fire in his chest burned hotter with every second. "You will not lay a hand on him. You've already terrified him enough. What exactly are you planning to assess? His bark? His limp? Or are you just determined to prove you weren't wrong coming here?" Murmurs rippled from the small crowd forming along the fence line. A woman's voice rang out, trembling but firm. "That dog has been here for years. He's gentle. He's never harmed anyone." Another voice added, "You've got the wrong dog. Everyone knows Duke." The tall officer's expression twitched, the mask of authority beginning to crack under the weight of scrutiny. Still, his pride anchored him in place. His hand flexed near his belt once more, a silent threat that made several neighbors gasp. Mark noticed it. His stomach churned with dread, but his rage surged stronger. He pointed directly at the officer. "Keep your hand away from that belt. He's not dangerous. The only danger here is your arrogance. The shorter officer glanced nervously at the gathering crowd, his voice quieter when he spoke. Maybe there's been a mistake. The complaint might have been about another dog. We've had reports of a stray in the area. Mark seized on the opening. Exactly. A stray. Not Duke. My dog hasn't left this yard in months. You've stormed onto private property, and instead of admitting you're wrong, you're doubling down. The tall officer's jaw tightened. Sir, lower your voice. Lower my voice? Mark thundered. You barged in here shouting at an old dog, and you expect me to lower mine. The tension snapped taut, like a wire stretched too thin. Duke whimpered again, pressing against Mark's leg. The neighbors leaned closer, their voices rising. Let the dog be, someone shouted. Police shouldn't harass harmless animals, another chimed in. The tall officer's eyes flickered, realizing the tide of public opinion was against him. Still, his pride refused to bow. He crossed his arms over his chest, glaring at Mark with steel in his eyes. The shorter officer, however, stepped slightly forward, speaking in a calmer tone. Sir, maybe we can resolve this. Do you have documentation for your dog? Vaccination records, license, anything like that? If you can show us proof, it'll help clear this up. Mark took a deep breath, trying to rein in the storm of emotions swirling inside him. He gave Duke another reassuring stroke along the back before answering. Fine. I'll get the papers. But he stays with me. You don't touch him. The tall officer's nostrils flared, but after a moment, he gave a stiff nod. Mark guided Duke slowly toward the back door, his old companion hobbling beside him, each step deliberate and heavy. Neighbors parted to let them through, some whispering encouragement. Hang in there, Duke. You're safe now, boy. Inside the house, Mark's hands trembled as he rummaged through a dusty folder, pulling out the vet records. Vaccinations, license, microchip papers, everything in order. His heart ached as he imagined what could have happened had he returned just minutes later. When he stepped back outside, the yard was hushed, every eye fixed on him. He handed the folder to the shorter officer, his movements steady but his voice still sharp. Here. Every document you need. Now tell me, does this look like a dangerous dog to you? The officer flipped through the pages, his expression softening with every line. Finally, he looked up, his eyes sympathetic. Everything checks out. He's licensed, vaccinated, chip. Sir, your dog is clear. Mark turned his gaze to the tall officer, his voice a low growl. And you? For a long, heavy moment, the man stood silent. Then, with lips pressed into a thin line, he muttered, Looks like there was a mistake. A hush fell across the crowd. Whispers broke out, phones recorded the admission, and neighbors exchanged glances of vindication. The tall officer's pride was bruised, but the truth was undeniable. Mark bent down, pressing his hand firmly against Duke's scruff. His voice was low, filled with both fury and relief. You're safe now, boy. They won't touch you again. Yet in the back of his mind, Mark felt the echo of what had nearly happened. Had he not returned when he did, had the neighbors not spoken up, the outcome could have been far darker. And as the officers shifted uncomfortably under the watchful eyes of the community, Mark realized this was not the end of the ordeal. It was only the beginning. The tall officer's reluctant admission lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. Neighbors exchanged glances, their whispers rising into a hum of judgment that wrapped around the officers like a tightening rope. The shorter one held the folder of papers carefully, as though the documents were fragile truths he did not dare deny. The taller one shifted his stance, his eyes darting between the watching crowd and the trembling dog at Mark's side. When they finally turned and walked out of the yard, stiff-backed and silent, a wave of low voices followed them. Some were mocking, others disapproving. One neighbor clapped slowly, a gesture that was both sarcastic and condemning. The officers did not respond. They stepped through the gate, heads lowered just enough to betray the weight pressing against their authority. Their patrol car rolled away, the sound of its engine fading into the distance, but the tension they left behind clung heavily to the street. Mark dropped to one knee beside Duke. The dog's breathing was still uneven, but his body eased slightly under his master's touch. Mark whispered, his voice trembling with both anger and affection. "You're safe now. I've got you. No one is ever going to treat you like that again." From beyond the fence, Mrs. Flanagan, the wiry-haired woman with sharp eyes, stepped forward. She placed a hand on the top rail, her expression lined with worry. "Are you both all right?" she asked softly. Mark looked up, his jaw tight. "We're fine now. But you saw what they tried to do." "I did," she replied, her voice firm. "And so did half the neighborhood. That was no dangerous dog I saw cowering against the fence. That was cruelty disguised as protocol." Another voice called from across the street. It was Mr. Leonard, an older man leaning heavily on a cane. He shook his head in disbelief. "I've lived here 20 years. I've known Duke nearly as long. Never once has he hurt anyone. For them to storm in like that—" He trailed off, his voice heavy with contempt. The murmurs swelled, neighbors now openly discussing what had just happened. Some muttered about filing complaints, others speculated about who had called the police in the first place. Mark clenched his fists. The question gnawed at him too. Who had made that call? Who had described his loyal, aging companion as a threat? By the time the small crowd dispersed, night had begun to fall. The golden glow of the setting sun painted the fences in amber light, but for Mark, the warmth of the evening could not reach him. He guided Duke inside, helping him settle onto his worn blanket near the living room window. The old dog sighed, laying his head down, but his eyes darted to every shadow as though still wary of uniforms stepping into his sanctuary. Mark paced the floor, his thoughts storming. He had always respected the police, always believed in their role to protect. But tonight that trust cracked. If they could treat Duke with such hostility, what would stop them from repeating the same mistake with someone else? Or worse, with someone who had no one to defend them? He tried to rest that night, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw Duke cornered, trembling, the tall officer's hand hovering near his belt. Sleep abandoned him. Instead, he sat by the window, glancing toward the street every time headlights passed. By morning, word had already spread further. The neighborhood's online forum buzzed with posts. Videos from last night circulated, clips showing the officers looming over Duke, the neighbors shouting in protest, and Mark's voice rising in defense. Comments poured in. "This is outrageous. How could they treat a senior dog like that? Those officers need to be held accountable." Others speculated about the caller. Some mentioned a new family who had recently moved in a few blocks away. Rumor claimed they had been complaining about dogs barking at night. Mark read through it all with a mix of gratitude and unease. Gratitude that so many stood by him. Unease because the anger in the posts was growing, threatening to spiral into something bigger than he intended. He didn't want Duke to become the face of a feud. He wanted peace. But peace, it seemed, would not come so easily. Later that day, while Duke dozed by the window, Mrs. Flanagan knocked on the door. Mark opened it to find her clutching a folded piece of paper. Her eyes gleamed with determination. "I've been asking around," she said. "No one I know called the police. But the new family on Birch Lane, the Joneses, have been muttering about a big dog scaring their children. Could they have mistaken Duke for that stray people keep seeing near the alleys?" Mark's jaw tightened. He had heard about the stray too, a large, ragged-looking shepherd mix that roamed the trash bins at night. But Duke had not set foot beyond his yard in months. The thought that someone might confuse his gentle companion with a prowling stray stung deeply. "Maybe," Mark admitted. "But that doesn't excuse how the officers handled it. They didn't come to ask questions. They came ready to intimidate." Mrs. Flanagan nodded. "You should consider speaking to the precinct. At least let them know what happened. If they're responding to calls like this, Someone else's dog could be next. Mark looked past her toward the street, where Duke once more lay in a patch of sunlight behind the fence. His friend's muzzle rested on the grass, eyes half closed, but his ears twitched at every sound, no longer at ease. The sight tore at Mark's heart. "Yes," he said finally. "I will speak to them. They need to hear it from me." But even as he said it, a flicker of unease twisted in his chest. He wondered if confronting the system would bring more trouble. Yet when he looked back at Duke, the answer was clear. For his old companion's sake, silence was no longer an option. The morning was crisp when Mark finally gathered the courage to step into the police precinct. He had spent the night replaying the incident in his mind, every detail carved into his memory: the harsh voices, the trembling dog, the uneasy crowd, and the officer's hand hovering near his belt. Sleep had not come easily. Duke had paced restlessly, whining at the back door as though expecting uniforms to burst in again. Now, as Mark pushed open the heavy glass door of the precinct, a wave of unease swept over him. The air inside was cool, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above rows of desks and bulletin boards cluttered with notices. Officers moved briskly through the lobby, their uniforms a reminder of the authority that had nearly crushed his companion. A woman at the front desk looked up from her computer. "Can I help you, sir?" Mark cleared his throat, his voice firm but laced with restrained anger. "My name is Mark Winters. Yesterday, 2 officers came to my property and harassed my dog after receiving a false report. I need to speak with someone about it." The woman studied him for a moment, recognition flickering in her eyes. She must have seen the videos circulating online. She nodded, picking up the phone and speaking briefly into the receiver before gesturing toward a row of chairs. "Someone will be with you shortly." Mark sat, his hands clasped tightly together. Every tick of the clock on the wall felt like a hammer striking the edges of his patience. His mind drifted back to Duke, who even now was probably lying in his usual sunny spot, but with one ear lifted in constant vigilance. That image only steeled Mark's resolve. After what felt like an eternity, a door opened and a man in a neatly pressed uniform stepped out. He was older than the 2 officers from the night before, his hair streaked with gray, his face lined but calm. His nameplate read Lieutenant Harassed. "Mr. Winters," he said, extending a hand. "Come with me." Mark rose and followed him into a cramped office. Papers were stacked high on the desk, and a single tired-looking plant leaned toward the fluorescent light. Harris gestured for him to sit. "I've reviewed the incident," the lieutenant began, his voice steady. "There was an anonymous report about a dog matching the description of yours. The officers responded according to protocol." "Protocol?" Mark snapped, leaning forward. "Protocol is yelling at a senior dog until he cowers against a fence? Protocol is barging onto private property without knocking? My dog is harmless. You've traumatized him." Harris's eyes softened, though his posture remained composed. "I understand your anger. The report claimed a large dog had been growling at children. The officers responded with caution." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But based on what your neighbors witnessed, it seems there was a miscommunication. Possibly even an exaggerated call." "Miscommunication," Mark repeated, bitterness dripping from the word. "That's one way to put it. What I saw was harassment. What my dog felt was terror." The lieutenant sighed, folding his hands on the desk. "We are conducting an internal review. I can't undo what happened, but I can tell you steps are being taken. The call may have been exaggerated. In some cases, it could even be a prank. But we take all reports seriously." Mark's jaw tightened. "Serious is fine. But aggressive? That's unacceptable. My dog has been restless all night. He doesn't understand why men in uniforms came into his yard and treated him like a criminal." The room fell silent for a moment, the tension heavy. Harris leaned back in his chair, his eyes thoughtful. "I'll be honest with you. We've had issues lately, false reports, exaggerated claims. Sometimes fear makes people overreact. But that doesn't excuse what happened in your yard. You're right. It should have been handled differently. Mark exhaled, some of the fury in his chest easing but not disappearing. What if it wasn't me? What if no one was there to stop them? What if the dog was younger and actually reacted? Do you realize what could have happened? The lieutenant's gaze dropped for a moment, his expression tinged with regret. I do. Which is why I want to make this right. We're already looking into revising how we handle animal complaints. But I also need you to understand, our officers are trained to respond quickly when children are reported at risk. Mark closed his eyes briefly, forcing himself to steady his breathing. Mark exhaled, some of the fury in his chest easing but not disappearing. What if it wasn't me? What if no one was there to stop them? What if the dog was younger and actually reacted? Do you realize what could have happened? The lieutenant's gaze dropped for a moment, his expression tinged with regret. I do. Which is why I want to make this right. We're already looking into revising how we handle animal complaints. But I also need you to understand, our officers are trained to respond quickly when children are reported at risk. Mark closed his eyes briefly, forcing himself to steady his breathing. And now you've put another life at risk. Duke has never hurt anyone. He deserved better. Harris nodded solemnly. I agree. And I assure you, we'll address this internally. When Mark finally stood to leave, the lieutenant offered a small but genuine apology. It did little to soothe the raw anger simmering in Mark's chest, but it was a step. As he walked back to his car, the crisp air filled his lungs, but it did not calm him. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Pulling it out, he saw a notification from the neighborhood forum. A new thread had exploded overnight. Who called the cops on Duke? Dozens of comments speculated about the caller, and some even accused the new family on Birch Lane by name. Mark frowned. He didn't want a witch hunt. But deep down, he needed to know the truth. Who had placed that call? Who had nearly cost his loyal friend his peace? And more importantly, what would he do when he found out? The days after Mark's visit to the precinct felt strangely heavy, as if the neighborhood itself held its breath. Every time he walked Duke into the yard, he sensed eyes watching from windows. Conversations grew hushed when he passed. Some neighbors approached him with sympathy, others with outrage, demanding to know if the police had apologized. Yet beneath all the support lurked a more pressing question that spread like wildfire in every corner of the suburb. Who had called the police in the first place? Mark saw the discussions swell in the community's online forum. Posts piled up with clips of the confrontation, each one replaying the image of Duke cowering under the officer's shadows. Comment sections burned with speculation. It must have been the new family on Birch Lane. They've been complaining about dogs barking. I heard them say a big shepherd was scaring their kids. Mark scrolled through the comments late at night, the glow of his phone illuminating his tired face. Duke lay beside him, restless, his ears twitching at the slightest creak outside. Every time a car rolled down the street, Duke lifted his head, eyes wide and wary. Age had slowed his body, but fear had sharpened his senses. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Mrs. Flanagan knocked on Mark's door again. She held a folded map of the block in her hand, her eyes sharp with determination. I've asked around, she said the moment he opened the door. The older residents didn't call. But the Jones family, new folks on Birch Lane, were seen complaining just last week about a dog growling near their yard. Could be them. Mark took the map, studying the marked spot. His jaw tightened. He had nothing against the Joneses, but if they had confused Duke with some stray, the damage had already been done. That dog they saw, Mark said quietly. What if it wasn't Duke? What if there really is another one? Mrs. Flanagan pursed her lips. That's the rumor. Some people have spotted a big, ragged shepherd in the alleyways. They say it prowls at night, digging in trash. Maybe that's the dog the Jones kids saw. The thought lodged deep in Mark's chest. If it were true, Then Duke had been wrongly accused because of mistaken identity. Anger flared again, but it was mixed now with something else, curiosity. Later that night, Mark sat on his back porch. The air was cool, the sky draped in a sheet of stars. Duke rested at his feet, muzzle on his paws, finally drifting into a rare, peaceful sleep. But Mark's ears caught something beyond the fence. A faint rustling, followed by a low, guttural bark that didn't belong to Duke. He rose, stepping quietly across the yard until he reached the fence. Peering through the slats, he caught a glimpse of movement in the alley. A shape, lean and shadowed, slipped behind a trash bin. The glow of a distant street lamp illuminated the outline just long enough, broad shoulders, ragged fur, eyes that glinted before vanishing into darkness. Mark's breath caught. There it was, the stray. For a long moment he stood frozen, his pulse racing. The dog was real. The Jones family hadn't lied. And yet, instead of barking to draw attention, Mark remained silent, his mind spinning. If that was the dog behind the complaint, why had the officers leapt so quickly at Duke? Duke stirred behind him, lifting his head with a soft whine, as though sensing the presence just beyond the fence. Mark turned back, crouching to stroke his old friend's ears. "Not you, boy. Never you," he whispered. The following morning, Mark decided he needed answers. He drove to the local animal shelter, a small brick building tucked near the edge of town. Inside, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and wet fur. A young volunteer greeted him warmly. "You're Mark Winters, aren't you?" the young man asked. "The one with the old shepherd? We heard about what happened." Mark nodded stiffly. "Have you had reports of a stray around my neighborhood? Large shepherd type, ragged coat?" The volunteer's face grew serious. "Yes. We've had several calls. Always at night. He's been rummaging through trash cans, skittish around people. Could be the same dog you've seen. Do you know where he came from?" Mark pressed. The volunteer shook his head. "Not yet. But some think he might be lost, not truly feral. He avoids people, but doesn't attack. Just scared and hungry." On the drive home, Mark's mind was a storm. So it was true, a stray was out there. That meant the anonymous call wasn't a fabrication, but a terrible mistake. His Duke had been caught in the crossfire of fear and misidentification. When he returned, Duke met him at the door, tail wagging weakly, his eyes still clouded but trusting. Mark knelt, rubbing his muzzle. "It wasn't you," he murmured. "It never was you." But the revelation didn't soothe him. It only sharpened his determination. If one anonymous call could nearly cost Duke his peace, what about the next? What about other dogs, other owners? The stray had to be found, not to be punished, but to prevent more confusion, more fear. That night, as Mark stood once again on his porch, he heard it, the faint growl from the alley, followed by the scrape of claws against pavement. The shadow returned, moving like a ghost through the dim light. Duke rose slowly, ears twitching, his body tense but too old to pursue. Mark clenched the railing of the porch, his decision solidifying. He would not wait for another mistake. He would find the truth about this stray, and in doing so, protect his own dog once and for all. But deep down, he knew this was only the beginning.